Everyone, today we will be discussing the role of a forensic psychologist in our discussions for this week. So in terms of the role of a forensic psychologist, many questions come about in terms of what a forensic psychologist does. And to be honest, a forensic psychologist is really someone who's going to be studying the actions and the motives of criminals and also trying to apply psychological and criminal justice theories into the practice of understanding behavior, not only in a criminal law setting in terms of a court setting or even just within a prison setting or a jail setting, but also trying to understand criminal behavior in terms of predicting criminal behavior for the future, or even why it is that individuals may lead to becoming criminals for whatever the reason may be. Let those be dispositional, such as personality traits, or even situational factors that might drive individuals to potentially becoming criminals later on. So with the idea of a forensic psychologist is really someone who's there to really understand those behavioral components associated with criminal behavior, or what may lead an individual to criminal behavior. So with forensic psychology as a whole, it's really this application of the scientific and professional aspects associated with psychology that ultimately question not only issues related to law and the legal system, but also to criminal behavior and behavior as a whole, but from a criminal or a law perspective as well. So when we think about the aspect of forensic psychology is really the blending of multiple areas of interest. These are going to include aspects associated with clinical psychology, also with experimental psychology, and also looking at the legal or the law aspects associated with the criminal justice system, or with the legal system as a whole. So here when you see these three Venn diagrams, these Venn diagrams essentially indicate how it is that they all overlap with each other in terms of trying to understand the aspects of behavior from a legal perspective. So we do see that there is going to be this aspect of the clinical component associated with psychology and overlap with legal behavior or the legal aspects with the law, experimental or the research aspect also associated with clinical psychology, and also with the legal aspects of the criminal justice system. So we definitely do see quite a bit of overlap in terms of the multiple facets of what forensic psychology is really made up of. So we see that with the practice of forensic psychology, many questions that come about in terms of what a forensic psychologist does really revolve around what kind of employment opportunities may I potentially have in the future. And that's actually a very good question for anyone who is wanting to potentially do a career in forensic psychology. Again, let that be the experimental aspect of forensic psychology or even the clinical aspect of forensic psychology. And to be honest, even though we've already talked about this in some previous weeks in terms of some of our lectures, I'll reiterate this again. Forensic psychologists can really do quite a bit of work in terms of the legal system. They can actually work hand in hand with the court to uncover psychological issues related to an individual who may be on trial. They may also look at the psychological aspects associated with criminal activity as a whole. So again, looking at the research component associated with criminal behavior. Also looking at the psychological issues with how to treat criminals who are already inside the criminal justice system. So providing treatment for them, or potentially anything such as group therapy or even individual therapy. Piloting or implementing treatment programs for individuals is also going to be very important. And essentially what that means for us is that we may design, as a forensic psychologist who may be clinical in their practice, how it is that we're going to treat individuals who are already within the criminal justice system, that something may be particular to them on the individual basis, or again, even as a group setting, or even trying to change specific aspects associated with situations within the criminal justice system, or even within a prison or a jail setting that might actually help the individual become better adapted within the prison setting or the jail setting, and also potentially help them whenever it is that they're going to be leaving those settings as well. So when looking at this aspect of a forensic psychologist, the main overarching goal of a forensic psychologist is really, if you're looking at it from a clinical perspective, it's really to try to modify the offender's behavior or try to understand the psychological aspects associated with that criminal behavior with that individual. In some instances, again, a clinical forensic psychologist may be a person who is also just there to do assessments. Let those be personality assessments. Let those be lie assessments that sometimes are given to individuals, or even adaptability assessments that are sometimes given to individuals who may be entering or even exiting the legal system. So here it's very important for us to understand that any practice that's taken upon by a clinical forensic psychologist or even an experimental forensic psychologist are really to be able to have a research evidence to support any practices or any research that's going on with these special populations. So one thing to always consider is that anything that's done within the field of psychology, again, let that be clinical or experimental, which are the two major divisions of the field of psychology, everything has to be evidence-based. In other words, all of it has to be based on empirical research for ourselves. So even if we're doing something that's going to be non-treatment focused, such as just general experimental psychology research on trying to understand witness testimony or false testimonies, or looking at different aspects associated with how testimonies are given within the court setting or with criminal behavior as a whole, it has to really be based on empirical evidence. And a lot of the times, an individual who's going to be a forensic psychologist may be asked to come and give expert testimony within the court. And again, this has to be a person who's going to be knowledgeable enough to be able to say or claim that they are an expert. So here we never want individuals who are, although they're a forensic psychologist, they may be an experimental forensic psychologist dealing with, for instance, eyewitness testimony. They would never go in and be an expert witness for trying to understand the assessment aspects associated with an individual who's on trial. So we would never want to do that because that's outside of our area of expertise unless we have expertise in those multiple areas. Another aspect that we can also see with forensic psychologists in terms of what it is that they may work with is that they may work with individuals who are on parole boards. They may work very closely with individuals who are on parole boards. So ultimately, these parole boards are going to be these panels of individuals who are going to decide if an offender or a person who's already been sentenced to a crime may be eligible for parole after a given period of time, based on their behavior or based on their conduct that they may have had within the prison setting, or whatever the case may be. So here we can see that forensic psychologists may also work very closely with them. Now, another question that generally comes about in terms of the role of a forensic psychologist is really, what is it that a forensic psychologist can really do within a court setting? So if they're there as an expert witness, what kinds of testimonies can they give? How much can they disclose about specific information associated with the prisoner? Are they bound by any psychologist client or practitioner client confidentiality rules or anything of that nature? So here it's very, very important for us to understand how it is that we generally have evidence being admitted into the courtroom, and also how testimonies are allowed in the courtroom or if they are not. Now, in terms of admissibility of evidence, some very important rules actually are dictated by the government in terms of how it is that we can actually have admissibility of evidence. The Fry Rule, which is a rule of general acceptance, ultimately states that expert scientific opinion can be admitted only if the principles on which it is based has gained general acceptance in the relevant scientific community. And what that means is that if there are practices that this expert individual is coming in and using to be able to give their testimony, even though they have those practices that this individual who's claiming to be an expert is using, if they are not generally accepted by the community that is scientific in its nature, and they do not believe it to be valid or reliable as a scientific community, then we would not accept that evidence into the court setting in that particular instance. Because just because that individual who claims to be an expert says that, yes, I use this technique and I am the expert, then we must admit it into the court, doesn't necessarily mean that it will be. So here we have to see what the general community sees as a whole in terms of being able to allow that evidence in or not. The Daubert Rule is also this rule of general acceptance, or actually will assist also with the tier of fact. And what essentially that means is that an expert scientific opinion can be admitted under the general acceptance standard, or if a judge actually rules that the testimony or that procedure or that scientific opinion by that individual is going to be allowed in or not. So even though an individual may say, I use this particular technique, or I am saying that I am the expert, but even though the scientific community may not approve of that individual's technique or what it is that they're saying, if the judge feels that that is going to be allowed, they can actually allow that information in as well. Now, one big area of interest that always comes about in terms of forensic psychology is always this aspect of prediction. Within psychology as a whole, one of the things that we're always asked to always examine is the aspect of predicting behavior in the future. And that's a very big issue for us in psychology because, as with anything, this is really based on odds in some particular instances, right? So we have the whole aspect of statistical significance, and we have the aspect of odds being played into that aspect, the aspects of probabilities. So here, whenever it is that we're asked about the prediction of dangerousness, this is a big issue because now all of a sudden you're asking a forensic psychologist in this particular instance, how likely is it that this person is going to continue to be dangerous in the future, or will they be dangerous within the prison setting or within the jail setting? Will they display any types of behaviors that may be dangerous to themselves or to others? And that's not necessarily an easy issue to address. And to be honest with you, the legal profession is not necessarily confident in the mental health professional's ability to predict dangerousness. And essentially what that means is that even though psychologists can predict behavior to a certain extent, to a certain degree, that's not always going to be accepted by the legal profession. So the legal profession, let's say for instance a lawyer, a judge, or the jury might say, we may assume that even though you, given your expert testimony, say that this person is not going to be dangerous in the future to themselves or to others, we may still feel otherwise about that. So for instance, to take into consideration whenever an individual is up for parole, that they may be communicating with the parole board and they may say, I am not dangerous, I am not going to be dangerous to myself or to others. A forensic psychologist may be there to assert psychologically that the individual is not going to be dangerous as well, but yet the parole board says, we ultimately think that you will be dangerous to yourself or to others, so we're going to deny parole in this particular instance. So here we can actually see that the legal profession may not always have 100% confidence in that aspect of a mental health profession. And a lot of that also stems from somewhat of the stereotype that psychologists actually have in terms of the way that we actually do research. This is something I talk quite a bit about in terms of my research methods courses, that one of the things that we always consider is the aspect of a scientific discipline or not. We always make this distinction in other scientific areas of hard sciences versus soft sciences, and how do we categorize psychology? Is it a hard science or a soft science? We generally have this idea that the hard sciences are always going to be things like physics, chemistry, biology, and all these different areas that we may consider to be very difficult, and they consider those to be hard sciences. While if you look at things like sociology, psychology, social work, and even criminal justice, they're considered to be more on the soft sciences on the soft sciences end of the scale. And one of my arguments is always what makes something a hard science and what makes something a soft science. And to be honest, when I've asked scientists that come from what we would call these hard sciences, right, quote unquote, the hard sciences, I was asking them what makes it difficult or what makes it hard. I've never really gotten a clear answer as to what makes it hard. Is it that it's grounded in evidence? Well, we have the same thing in psychology. Well, it's more difficult to understand. It's much more theoretical. In psychology, it's all theoretical because we deal with theories. We have no laws in psychology, to be honest with you. So we have nothing that's always 100% accepted. That's why we test theories continuously. So it's always this big issue that tends to come about with psychologists of, are we really a science or are we not a science? So we even get placed sometimes in the category of pseudoscience. And granted, that may have been some of the research and some of the things that we may have done in the past that may not necessarily have been scientifically driven, but that perspective has changed tremendously within our field within the last 100 years, that we've really been stepping up our game and saying that we are really a science and we follow the scientific method, thus we are a scientific discipline. But yet, definitely individuals in the general community or also within the legal system or within the legal professions may necessarily have a negative perception of the field of psychology and may see some of the things that mental health professionals provide as being kind of this mumbo-jumbo or the pseudoscience of psychology that they call it, right? So in some instances, our perspective may not be taken into consideration, even though we are going to be considered the expert witnesses within the field at that time. Now, we can see that with the use of a forensic psychologist, especially with the clinical forensic psychologist, a clinical forensic psychologist really, in some instances, is going to be able to go in and provide assessments for individuals who may be on trial or who may be entering or exiting the criminal justice system at that point. So they may be up for parole, and they may be given an assessment to see if they may have psychological stability or the aspect of dangerousness or other key elements that are going to be important for a parole board to potentially make a decision, or even the aspect of an adaptation that they may have in terms of exiting the prison setting at that point. So one of the things that we actually see with much assessment in terms of a clinical forensic psychologist is really this big debate between or within psychology of using clinical assessments versus relying on data to assess dangerousness in some particular instances. With the clinical judgments, this is really going to be based much more on the human judgments. In many instances, you'll find that especially statistically driven psychologists may say that the aspects of a human judgment are going to be biased. They may be subjective in their nature, so those are not necessarily going to be the best instruments for us to be able to use. So in contrast to that, we might want to use what's called an actuarial judgment, which is really going to be statistically driven or statistically based. And again, with this aspect of an actuarial judgment, we're essentially saying we are taking out the bias and we're taking out the subjectivity of the human judgment and really basing ourselves on what the risk is going to be of that individual potentially being dangerous out in the future or not. And to be honest, one of the things that we have found over much research in terms of the field of psychology is that the best indicators of future dangerousness are, number one, previous dangerousness and assaults of the individual, and number two, lack of medication compliance. So we see if the individual continues to be dangerous to themselves or to others and continues to assault other individuals, so potentially getting into fights, being very confrontational with other individuals, and also does not want to cooperate with actually taking medications when they are being prescribed to them by a psychiatrist, those are generally going to be very good indicators that the individual will continue to be dangerous in the future or not. So what are some of the skills that are going to be required of a forensic psychologist to be able to do their job accurately and to the best of their abilities? Communication is going to be a must. We would assume here that with any forensic psychologist, especially if they're going to be going into a court setting, that they have to have the ability to communicate as effectively as possible with others. So here, what you want is an individual who's not only going to be scientific in their knowledge and in their manner of speaking, but you don't want them to be too advanced in terms of the way that they communicate with others. So a skill that needs to be attained by a forensic psychologist, especially if they're going to be going to a court trial as an expert witness, is that they have to be able to discuss whatever their perspectives are or whatever their findings are to individuals who are on the jury who may not necessarily be experts within the field. So here, having good communication and being able to discuss things appropriately within a court setting or even with the criminal themselves or the person who's on trial is going to be very important in terms of good communication. They also have to be good listeners. They have to be able to speak comfortably with people about very sensitive topics or about very uncomfortable topics in some particular instances. As well, aside from just communicating with others, it's going to be very important for them to be able to write well. So being able to write the reports or to produce the reports are going to be very, very important as well. Some additional skills that are going to be required by a forensic psychologist is really having the ability to observe other individuals. Looking, for instance, at their body language or looking at the way they interact with others is going to be fundamental to being able to make a correct assessment in terms of the individual's behavior or their adaptation to their environment. They also have to have good problem-solving skills, and in terms of problem-solving, changing, for instance, methodologies or treatment techniques is going to be essential to being able to provide the best treatment for an individual. And also being able, again, to communicate effectively within a court setting whenever it is that they provide any type of expert testimonies that are going to be required of them in the future. So who is it that forensic psychologists work with? Forensic psychologists, aside from just working with court settings or with lawyers, they may also work directly with offenders in a prison setting. They may also work with prison staff to reduce and even manage stress from prison staff. That's going to be very, very important for us to be able to evaluate that kind of behavior and also of the offender to reduce and manage their stress as well. Part of what we'll be reading this semester in terms of our book of The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo is that he goes into great detail talking about how the stresses associated with being a prison guard or being a prisoner really do take a toll on individuals within those situations. Now, we may also want to look at other aspects associated with the prison setting. Is bullying going on, and not just on the part of other inmates, but also on part of the prison staff, if that potentially is happening? And again, the book that we're going to be reading this semester as our additional reading really alludes to this as quite a bit in terms of potential abuse that may be occurring within the prisons. So aside from just working with individuals within the prison settings, who else might they work with? They might work also with victims of a crime. They may work with witnesses to support them and to help them overcome any types of problems that they may have suffered during the criminal event, or also helping them being able to provide their testimonies to the best of their abilities. They may also work closely with judges and with juries to also help them understand the different psychological aspects that are playing into decisions that are sometimes being made by juries or by judges, and also by behaviors that are sometimes being displayed by individuals who may be placed on trial. Individuals who are also forensic psychologists, if they decide that they don't necessarily want to go into practice and be an individual who's going to be in the court or in the prison settings, they can also work for academic institutions such as being a professor and focusing in on research associated with psychology and law. So really kind of bridging the gap between the two disciplines and continuing to do research, but under much more controlled situations. I also mentioned working for prison services or with parole boards in some particular instances, and even working with government agencies as a whole to try to provide better treatment facilities for individuals who are going through the criminal justice system as well. They may also work with probation officers, with police services, with social services, and even just with universities in general, even as collaborators in terms of doing research or even teaching specific courses associated with forensic psychology or with psychology and law as a whole. Now, a big question that also comes up in terms of a forensic psychologist is, all right, if I want to be a forensic psychologist, what kind of education do I need? To be honest, it's a great question. And to be honest, you need a PhD. And that's something that we want for all of our students at any university. That we just don't want our students to receive a bachelor's degree in their particular field, but rather we want them to go all the way up to getting a PhD and receiving board certifications when necessary. So when we think about forensic psychologists as a whole, approximately 3,600 degrees were awarded that were PhD, so a doctorate in philosophy associated in psychology were awarded, are awarded yearly. And about 1,600 PsyDs, which are doctorates in psychology, are awarded yearly. Now, a big question that many individuals ask is, what is the difference between a PhD and a PsyD? And that is a great question. A PhD, which is a doctorate of philosophy in your specific discipline. So for instance, myself, I have a PhD, but my PhD is in psychology. So it's a doctorate of philosophy in psychology. That's why we have that PhD component to it. We are individuals who tend to focus much more on research. We really don't do so much in terms of practice to a certain degree in my subfield. Now, there are a lot of individuals who are clinical psychologists who have PhDs, but a research component is required of them to receive their degrees. Now, individuals who receive doctorates in psychology generally are not required to do too much research, and they're not research-intensive programs. So individuals who have PsyD degrees tend to focus much more on the clinical practice aspects, so many more hours in terms of the clinical practice part of psychology and doing much less research. That's really the difference between the two. If you were to ask me which one is better, I really can't give you an answer to that because they both have their benefits and they both have their limitations, to be honest with you. It's just kind of whatever it is that you as an individual seeking a doctoral degree really is interested in doing as a profession in the future. So for instance, for myself, I was really interested in continuing to do research for the remainder of my career. That's why I went down the PhD route, because I was going to get a lot more training on the doctoral research side of the coin in this particular instance. Now, in terms of all the degrees that are awarded yearly in terms of PhDs and PsyDs, over half of them are actually in clinical or counseling psychology. And as of 2010, there are actually only 3 graduate training programs offering dedicated forensic psychology doctoral degrees. And again, let those be PsyDs or PhD programs. I've actually given you the names here of those 3 institutions for any of you who are interested in searching for potential forensic psychology doctoral programs within the United States. Now, it's very important to understand that one of the reasons that we require PhDs to be given, especially for individuals who are going to be experts in their field, are that if we want them to be able to have that distinction of being an expert, it's going to be very important for them to have the right education and the right training. So for any of us who just get bachelor's degrees, to be honest with you, none of us would ever be comfortable in calling ourselves experts within the field just because we have a bachelor's degree. It's really once you start receiving more certifications and more degrees that you really start now being more comfortable with that distinction of becoming an expert. And even then, we always still have these inner conflicts of, am I really an expert or am I not really an expert? That always is a big thing that we call that the imposter phenomenon for some individuals that go through that. Now, in terms of other educational programs, we actually have in the United States 25 institutions that offer doctoral degrees that have concentrations relating to forensic psychology, but are not necessarily forensic psychology programs 100%. So they may offer kind of a sub-concentration within forensic psychology, but their overall concentration is going to be in another area of psychology, maybe like cognitive psychology or clinical psychology. There are also postdoctoral fellowships in forensic psychology that I would recommend any of you who are interested in potentially following a career in forensic psychology. Don't just stop at your doctoral programs. Think even of postdoctoral fellowships. I know it's a lot of school. I know it's a lot of education that you're going through here, but it's going to be very, very effective for you and very beneficial for you, especially when, again, you're going to be working very closely with these individuals in terms of treatment or in terms of research and essentially being an expert witness or providing expert testimony within court settings. Now, in many instances, board certification may be required or is a plus for some forensic psychologists. So again, also do take note of that. In your textbook, there's a couple of websites that offer information associated with board certification for forensic psychologists. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you all about in terms of today's lecture is just some of the potential duties that, again, a forensic psychologist might do. So, again, aside from just the educational training, aside from just working with prison settings or with judges and juries or with parole boards or whatever the case may be in terms of many different facets of the criminal justice system, what are some of the things that a forensic psychologist might actually do in terms of their everyday duties? They may present assessments in terms of findings to multi-agencies, and what that means essentially, they may work with multiple agencies and try to help them understand how it is that psychology and law are really intertwined with each other, and how it is that we can provide best treatment or best situations for them within the present setting to ultimately allow the individual to be able to garner some sense of being able to overcome the problems that they're suffering from of these abnormal behaviors. They may also provide some type of crime analysis in terms of carrying out some type of assistance with police, with, again, local law enforcement or state or even federal law enforcement agencies in terms of some aspects of crime analysis, trying to understand the person's behavior. Also, training of prison staff is going to be very important in terms of how it is that they should communicate with the prisoners, how it is that they should behave to try to elicit some type of confidence and trust from the prisoners so that way things flow well within the prison setting as well. That's going to be very important, especially for mental health, not only of the prisoners, but also of the staff as well. And also last, evaluating and monitoring treatments associated with prison staff, for instance, juries, or even also the individuals who are in prison, the criminals at this point. So it's going to be very important for us to being able to look at all those different facets. And now these are just some examples of duties. These are not all. This is not an inclusive list. So do know that there are many more things that a forensic psychologist might potentially do that are going to be very, very important for us. All right, so that wraps up our discussion associated with the role of a forensic psychologist for this week. Hopefully everyone has enjoyed your discussion associated with this topic. Remember that there are some assignments that are going to be due on Blackboard for us this week, so please make sure to check your information sheet to know exactly what is due and at what times everything is due. Have a good rest of your day, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or call.